It happened on a Tuesday in January, a little after 7 at night. The wind had been building all day, throwing wet snow against the windows, and then somewhere out on a dark county road, a branch came down across a power line. That was all it took, one branch. And a modern house went quiet in a way that modern houses were never designed to survive. The lights went first. Then, a half-second later, the deeper sound underneath the house stopped. That low electric hum you stop hearing after a while, because it never turns off. The refrigerator fell silent. The furnace fan wound down and died. The well pump under the floor, the one that pushes water up to every faucet in the house, simply stopped mid-breath. For about 10 seconds, the family didn't move. They waited for it to come back on, the way you always do. It didn't come back on. And in that quiet, one at a time, the house began to show them everything it could no longer do. The thermostat on the wall went dark, and the heat that had been arriving invisibly through the vents just ended. Somebody tried the kitchen faucet out of habit. A cough of air, a few drops, then nothing. The water in this house does not move without electricity. Somebody else opened the refrigerator and stood there in the dark, letting the cold spill out, not yet understanding that opening it was the worst thing they could do. The stove wouldn't light. The microwave was a black box. The phone still glowed, but the little battery numbers were already falling, and the Wi-Fi router, the thing that connects them to weather, to news, to the outside world, had gone dead with everything else. Within 20 minutes, this warm, modern, comfortable house had become a cold box full of expensive equipment that no longer worked. Not because anything was broken, everything in that house was in perfect condition. It was all just waiting for one thing to come back. And that one thing wasn't coming back for 2 days. Now, take that exact same night, that same wind, that same snow, that same downed line, and drop it onto a house from the 1930s. And almost nothing happens. Oh, the family notices. Of course they notice. But there is no moment of panic, because there is nothing in that house that all depended on a single wire. The stove was already burning wood, so supper is already warm. There's light on the table. It's a flame, not a switch, but it's light. The water was carried in and stored before dark, the way it was every night. The heat isn't coming from a machine that failed. It's coming from a fire someone has been feeding all winter. The food isn't spoiling, because most of it was never in anything that needed to stay running. The old house didn't have more than the modern one. It had less, far less. It was harder to live in, colder in the corners, heavier on the back and the hands, and no one who lived through it wants to pretend it was some golden age. It was not. But it was built on a quiet idea the modern world has almost completely forgotten. Never let the whole house depend on any one thing. That old house always had a second way to cook, a second way to get water, a second way to make light, to stay warm, to keep food, to fix what broke. And behind every one of those second ways was a person who understood how it worked. Not from a manual, not from a video, but from having done it 100 times. That's what this is really about. Not the poverty, not the hardship, the redundancy, the second way. So tonight we're going to walk back into that house and count 20 things it had that a modern house genuinely no longer needs. Right up until the night it suddenly, desperately does. We're going backward, from 20 down to 1. And I'll tell you now, so you can watch for it, number 1 on this list is not an object at all. You will not find it on a shelf, in a cellar, or out in the yard. Number 1 was a person. And by the time we get there, you're going to know exactly who they were, because a lot of you were raised by them. Let's start the count. Number 20, the wood-burning cookstove. Start in the kitchen, because that's where the old house did its hardest thinking. In a 1930s home, the stove was not an appliance you turned on when you wanted it. It was the heart of the room, and it worked all day, every day, from before dawn until the last person went to bed. It cooked the food, yes, but it also heated the water, warmed the room, dried the mittens, And on the coldest nights, it was the reason the whole family drifted toward the kitchen and stayed there. Here is the part that matters for our story. That stove didn't need anything from outside the house to work. It needed wood, and the wood was already in the yard. When the power line came down on that January night, a modern electric range became a cold slab of metal. The wood stove didn't even notice. Supper went on. The kettle stayed hot. A modern kitchen has 5 ways to cook, and every single one of them dies at the same instant, because they all drink from the same wire. The old kitchen had 1 way to cook, and it answered to no one. That's the whole idea of this list, right there in the first item. Not more, just not dependent. Number 19. The full woodpile, stacked in October, for January. Walk out the back door of that old house in autumn, and you'd see it. The woodpile, built up against the coming winter, split and stacked and drying, weeks before anyone needed to burn a single log. Nobody stacked wood in January. By January, it was far too late. The warmth of the deep winter was prepared in the labor of the fall. That was the rhythm. You paid ahead, with your back and your hands, for comfort you wouldn't collect for months. There's a whole way of thinking buried in that woodpile, and the modern house lost it. We've been trained to expect that whatever we need will arrive exactly when we need it, and not 1 minute sooner. Heat on demand, food on demand, everything delivered the moment the want appears. The old house couldn't think that way. It had to look at October and see January. It had to prepare for a cold it couldn't yet feel. On the night the lines came down, the modern family had nothing put by, because nothing in modern life ever asks you to. The old family had a wall of split oak that represented 3 weekends of work done back when the weather was still mild, and every log of it was a small argument against panic. Number 18. Oil lamps and lanterns. When the sun went down in the 1930s, the house didn't go dark. It changed its light. Out came the oil lamps for the table, the lanterns for the barn and the cellar stairs, the wicks trimmed and the chimneys wiped clean, because a smoky chimney meant a dim, sooty light. Making light was a small evening chore, and everyone knew how to do it. Now, be honest about this. Electric light was one of the great gifts of the modern age, and nobody who ever cleaned a lamp chimney with a rag and a lot of patience is going to tell you otherwise. But look at what we traded. We got light so easy and so total that we forgot it was even a question. We built houses with no other way to see after dark, so when that one switch failed on the January night, the modern family was fumbling with phone flashlights, watching the battery numbers fall, rationing their own light. The old family struck a match, touched it to a wick, and the room came back. Not as bright, but it came back, and it would keep coming back for as long as there was oil in the can on the shelf. A second way to see in the dark. Small thing, until it isn't. Number 17. The hand pump and the water carried in. This one stops people, because we forget how completely modern water depends on electricity. In that modern house, the well pump under the floor is electric. No power, no pump, no water. Not to drink, not to wash, not to flush. The most basic substance in the house vanishes with the lights. The old house never had that vulnerability, because water in the old house was work, and work doesn't shut off when the grid does. Picture it. A child leaning their whole weight on the handle of the hand pump out by the porch, working it up and down until the water came, while their mother held the bucket steady underneath. Water was carried in and set by before dark. A pail in the kitchen, a reserve on the porch, the reservoir on the side of the stove kept full, so there was always warm water for washing. It was heavy, it was tiring, it was one more thing on the endless list of a day's labor, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you carrying water by the bucketful is something to miss. But on the night the pump died, the family that carried water by hand still had water. The family that got theirs by a silent electric motor had a house full of faucets and not a drop moving through any of them. Number 16. The root cellar. Down under the house, or dug into the side of a hill, was a room the modern home doesn't have and doesn't understand. The root cellar. Cool in summer, above freezing in winter, dark and steady and quiet. And it did something almost magical. When you think about it, it kept food for months, and it did it without a motor, without a wire, without a single moving part. The earth did the work. The temperature of the ground itself was the machine. Compare that to the refrigerator on the January night. The refrigerator is a wonderful thing that has exactly one flaw. It can never, ever stop. The moment the power cut out, everything inside it began a slow slide toward spoiling, and the family stood there knowing it and unable to do anything about it. The root cellar had no such fear. Potatoes, apples, carrots, cabbages, the jars of everything the garden had given up in September. All of it sat there in the cold dark, needing nothing, waiting patiently, indifferent to whether the wider world had power or not. One kept food by running forever. The other kept food by needing nothing. That's the difference between the two houses in a single cold room underground. Number 15. The shelves of home canning. Right alongside the cellar, or on the pantry wall, stood the jars. And I want to be careful here, because this channel has walked past these shelves before, and it would be easy to make this about thrift, about waste not, about grandma's preserves. That's not what this is. Look at that wall of jars the way the family looked at it. Tomatoes put up in the heat of August. Green beans, peaches, applesauce, pickles, whatever the garden and the season had offered. To us it might look like decoration. To them it was something much simpler and much heavier. It was winter with a little less fear. Every jar on that shelf was a meal that was already, in a sense, in the house, that couldn't spoil in a power outage, couldn't be cut off by a snowed-in road, couldn't be taken away by anything short of the shelf itself falling. The modern family, on the January night, had a refrigerator full of food quietly turning against them, and a freezer that was a ticking clock. The old family had a wall of glass jars that didn't care about the storm at all, not because they were sentimental about canning, because a full shelf in November was the difference between a hard winter and a frightening one. Number 14. The icebox, and knowing how to live without cold. Before the electric refrigerator, there was the icebox, a real box, insulated, with a block of ice in the top that a man delivered by wagon or truck, and a little pan underneath to catch the melt. It was the modern refrigerator's grandfather, and it taught a lesson the refrigerator let us forget. The icebox only kept things cool for a few days between deliveries, so the old kitchen never built its whole life around cold storage. It leaned on foods that didn't need to stay cold at all: the dried beans, the flour, the cured meat hanging in the shed, the jars on the shelf, the roots in the cellar. Cold was a luxury you used carefully, not a foundation you bet everything on. The modern kitchen made the opposite bet. It put almost everything behind a cold door and assumed the cold would never fail. And for years, it doesn't. Until one January night it does, and suddenly a family realizes that nearly everything they planned to eat that week required a machine that just stopped. The old kitchen had built its diet on a wider footing on purpose, so that losing the cold cost them a few things, not everything. Number 13. The pantry that was stocked deep. Open the pantry in the old house and you didn't find 3 days of food. You found weeks. A sack of flour, not a bag. Beans and rice and cornmeal in real quantity. Sugar, salt, coffee, lard. The staples that keep. Bought and stored in amounts that would look almost strange to us now, because we've been taught to buy small and buy often, trusting that the store will always be open and the road will always be clear. The deep pantry wasn't about hoarding. It was about the simple, hard-won knowledge that the world outside the house was not always reliable. Roads closed, money ran short at unpredictable times. Weather did what it wanted, so the house kept a cushion, enough staples that a bad week or a bad month didn't immediately become a crisis at the dinner table. On the January night, the modern family looked in the cupboard and did the math and realized they had maybe 2 or 3 real meals in the house, because everything else was a trip to a store that was now dark and snowed in. The old pantry didn't flinch. It was built for exactly this. not for one specific disaster, but for the general truth that you should never let the house get down to nothing. Number 12. The rain barrel and the stored water. Out at the corner of the house, under the downspout, sat the barrel. Rain came off the roof and filled it, and that water, not for drinking, but for washing, for the garden, for the animals, for 100 ordinary jobs, was simply there, gathered and waiting, having cost nothing and needing nothing. It's such a humble thing that it's easy to miss the intelligence in it. The old house was always looking for a second source, not just one way to get water, but 2, 3, the pump, the carried pail, the rain barrel, the creek if it came to that. Every essential thing had a backup, and the backup usually had a backup. Redundancy wasn't a fancy idea to those families. It was just how you kept a house alive when you couldn't count on anything to be guaranteed. The modern house has one water source, and it runs on electricity, and when the power died on the January night, that was the end of the water. One source. No barrel, no pail set by, nothing waiting. Number 11. The washtub and the washboard. And here's where we start moving toward the things people did with their own hands, because the second half of this list gets more personal. In the old house, clean clothes came from a galvanized tub, a washboard, a bar of hard soap, and a great deal of effort. Water heated on that same wood stove, clothes scrubbed by hand against the ridges of the board, wrung out, hung to dry, on a line in summer, near the stove in winter, socks steaming gently in the warm kitchen air. Now, the washing machine is one of the great liberators in the history of the home, and it freed millions of women from one of the most brutal, back-breaking chores that ever existed. Let's say that plainly and mean it. Nobody should want to go back to the washboard. But notice what the washboard could still do on the January night, that the machine couldn't. It could still work. It asked for nothing but hot water and a pair of hands. The modern washer, for all its mercy, was just one more silent white box against the wall the moment the power failed. The old way was harder in every possible sense, except one: it never stopped working. And that word, stopped, is the thread running through every single thing on this list so far. 10 things down, 10 to go. And as we move into the second half, the objects start to fall away, and something else starts to come into focus. Because the closer we get to number 1, the clearer it becomes that all of these second ways, all of this redundancy, all of these backups, none of them meant anything without the one thing that tied them all together. We'll find that thing at the end. Keep counting. Number 10. The sewing basket beside the chair. Late at night, after the supper things were cleared and the children were finally asleep, there was often one lamp still burning in the old house, and one person still awake beside it. And next to that chair sat the sewing basket. Needles, thread, a thimble worn smooth, buttons saved in a tin, scraps of cloth kept back from worn-out clothes. That basket was where the family's clothes got a second life, and a third, and a fourth. A torn seam didn't mean a lost shirt. A missing button didn't mean a trip to the store. A worn elbow got a patch. A frayed cuff got turned. A coat too small for the older child got let out and handed down to the younger one. None of it was glamorous. Most of it was done tired, at the end of a long day, by someone who had already worked since before dawn. But here's the quiet truth in that basket. The modern house, on the January night, had a closet full of clothes, and not one person in it who could have mended a real tear if their comfort depended on it. Not because they were lazy, because the skill simply left the house, one generation at a time, when it stopped being necessary. The old house didn't just own clothes, it knew how to keep them going. And that basket by the chair was the difference between having things and being able to maintain them. Number 9. The toolbox and the workbench. Out in the shed, or down in the cellar, or in the corner of the garage, there was a bench and a box of tools, and, this is the part that matters, someone who knew how to use them. Hand tools, mostly. A hammer, a saw, planes and files, and a drill you turned by hand. Nothing on that bench needed to be plugged in. Nothing on it could be shut off by a downed line. When something broke in the old house, the first question was never, "Who do we call?" It was, "Can I fix it?" And the answer, most of the time, was yes. The hinge rehung, the chair leg glued and clamped, the handle whittled new, the leak sorted out with a bit of patience and a few simple tools. A house that could repair itself was a house that didn't fall apart the first time something went wrong. The modern home is full of things that cannot be fixed at the bench. Sealed, electronic, designed to be replaced rather than repaired. And so we became something the old house would have found strange, a household that owns a great deal and can mend almost none of it. On the January night, there was nothing to plug in and nothing to call, and that toolbox, with hands that knew it, was worth more than a garage full of gadgets. Number 8. The garden and the saved seeds. Out past the yard was the garden, and the garden was not a hobby. It was a second grocery store that answered to no schedule and charged no money. Through the growing season, it fed the family straight off the vine, and everything it produced beyond that went onto those pantry shelves and down into that cellar for winter. But the deepest intelligence of the old garden wasn't the vegetables. It was the seeds. At the end of the season, the best of the crop wasn't eaten. It was saved. Dried, labeled, tucked away in envelopes and jars, so that next spring's garden was already sitting in a drawer in the kitchen, costing nothing, waiting. The garden didn't just feed the family this year. It carried the means to feed them next year, and the year after that, entirely inside the house. That's a kind of security the modern home doesn't have, and mostly doesn't think about. A food supply that renews itself, that doesn't depend on a store, a truck, a supply chain, or a working card reader. On the January night, it was frozen ground, of course. But the idea behind it, that a family should hold, in their own hands, the ability to feed themselves next season, that idea is what the modern house quietly gave away. Number 7. The chickens and the animals in the yard. A few hens in a coop out back, maybe a milk cow, maybe a hog being raised for fall. To the old family, these weren't pets, and they weren't a quaint touch of country living. They were a food supply that walked around, fed itself partly on scraps, and produced something every single day without a store being involved at all. Eggs in the morning that no power outage could stop. Milk that came whether or not the roads were open. Meat that was raised, not bought. The animals turned the family's leftovers and the yard's grass into food, and they did it on their own schedule, indifferent to the wider world entirely. It was daily work, animals always are, and nobody's pretending it was easy or clean or something everyone would want back. But think about the January night from the hen's point of view. Nothing changed for them at all. There would still be eggs in the morning. The modern family, standing in a cold kitchen, was completely cut off from any food they didn't already own. The old family had a small, feathered, self-renewing food supply that no storm and no downed line could switch off. Number 6. The cool of the cellar and the warmth of the fire, knowing how the house breathed. Here we start to leave the objects behind, because this next one isn't really a thing you can hold. It was a knowledge of how the house itself worked with the weather, instead of against it. The old family knew, without a thermostat telling them, which rooms held heat and which ones lost it. They knew to close off the far bedrooms in the deep of winter and pull the family into the warm heart of the house near the stove. They knew the cellar stayed cool in July and the upstairs baked, and they moved through the house by the season, sleeping and living where the house was kind, and closing the door on where it wasn't. They understood the house as a living thing, with warm places and cold places, and they used it. The modern house erased all of that with a single number on a wall. Set it to 70, and forget the house entirely. Forget which way it faces, where the sun falls, where the cold pools. It's a marvelous freedom, right up until the machine that maintains that 70 degrees goes silent. Then the modern family is stranded in a house they never actually learned to read. The old family, on the January night, gathered where they always gathered when it was cold, because they knew their house the way you know an old friend. Number 5. The clothesline. It seems too simple to make a list like this. A rope strung between two posts. But stay with it. The clothesline dried the family's laundry using nothing but the sun and the wind. Two things that never send a bill and never shut off. And in the old house, drying clothes was woven right into the rhythm of the day and the weather. You watched the sky. You knew what a good drying day looked like. In winter, the wash came in stiff from the cold or steamed dry by the stove. The modern dryer is a wonderful machine, and again, a real mercy, but it's also a perfect little portrait of what we traded. It does in an hour, with electricity, what the sun did for free in an afternoon, and when the power died on the January night, the dryer became a door with a drum behind it, while the clothesline, had anyone still strung one, would have gone right on working, exactly as it always had, needing nothing from anyone. The clothesline is on this list because it's almost the whole philosophy of the old house in one image. The simplest possible tool, drawing on something that can never be switched off, quietly doing its job for 100 years. Number 4. The stored away spares, the might need it someday shelf. Every old house had them, a shelf, a drawer, a corner of the cellar, where things were kept that had no immediate use but might someday, a coil of wire, a box of assorted nails and screws, spare hinges, odd lengths of pipe, a window pane, a length of rope, jars of buttons and washers, and parts saved off things that had finally worn out. To a modern eye, it can look like clutter. It wasn't. It was insurance. Because the old family knew something we've been comfortable enough to forget, that when something breaks, the part you need is very rarely the part you can easily get. The store might be closed, the money might be short, the road might be snowed in, as it was, on the January night. So you kept the raw materials of repair on hand so that fixing a thing didn't depend on the world outside cooperating. The house held, in its odd corners, most of what it needed to keep itself running. That's redundancy again, the whole spine of this list. Not one of anything. A spare, a substitute, a workaround, tucked away against the day it's needed. The modern home threw those shelves out in the name of tidiness and gained a cleaner garage and lost the ability to fix things on the night the fixing actually mattered. Number 3. The rhythms and the routines, the household that ran without being told. Now the objects are almost gone, and what's left is harder to point at. The old house ran on rhythms so deep that nobody had to be told what to do. Water carried in before dark. The stove fed and banked for the night. Wood brought in for morning, the lamps trimmed, the animals seen to, the bread started. Each task had its time, and each person had their part, and the whole thing turned like a wheel that had been turning for generations. Those routines were a kind of preparation that didn't feel like preparation. Because water was always carried in before dark, the family always had water at night, including the night the pump would have failed. Because the wood was always brought in, there was always dry wood by the stove, including the night the furnace died. The old house was ready for the emergency, not because it planned for that specific emergency, but because its ordinary daily rhythm already assumed the world might not cooperate. The modern home has no such rhythm, and doesn't need one, because everything arrives on demand. But that means when the demand can't be met, when the switch does nothing, there's no habit to fall back on, no routine that already put things in place. The old family didn't have to rise to the occasion on the January night. Their ordinary Tuesday had already done the work. Number 2. The second way to do everything. And here it is, gathered up into a single idea, the thing this entire list has really been about. The old house always had a second way. If the stove failed, there was the fireplace. If the pump failed, there was the pail and the barrel. If the store closed, there was the pantry and the cellar and the garden. If the coat tore, there was the needle and thread. Not one thing in that house carried the whole weight alone. Everything essential had a backup, and the backup often had a backup of its own. That's not poverty. Let's be very clear about that, because it's the heart of everything. That is not what being poor looks like. That is what being prepared looks like. A family could be genuinely short of money, many were, and still live in a house that had 2 answers to every question, because the redundancy didn't cost money. It cost thought, and effort, and knowledge, and the humility to assume that something, someday, would fail. The modern house made the opposite bet, quietly, over decades. It let every second way fall off, one at a time, in exchange for convenience, until it had exactly one way to do everything, and every one of those single ways ran through the same wire. Comfortable beyond anything the old family could have imagined, and more fragile than anything they would have tolerated. On the January night, the modern house lost everything at once, because everything in it had come to depend on the same single thing. The old house couldn't lose everything at once. It was never built that way. And number one, the person who knew how it all worked. Here we are. And number one was never going to be an object, because none of it, not the stove, not the pump, not the cellar, not the jars, not the second way to do anything, none of it worked on its own. Number one was the person who knew how the whole house ran. It was the mother who could look at a half-empty pantry and already see the week's meals. The father who could fix nearly anything on that bench with his hands. The grandmother who knew, without checking anything, exactly what was in the cellar and how long it would last. It was the person who knew how to bank a fire so it held through the night, how to work the pump when it lost its prime, how to read the sky for a drying day, how to make a torn coat last one more winter. The house was full of tools and stores and second ways, but it was the knowledge in those people that turned all of it into safety. That is what the modern home really lost. Not the wood stove, not the root cellar, not the clothesline. Those we could buy back tomorrow if we wanted to. What's harder to buy back is the person standing in the middle of it who understands how every piece works and what to do when something stops. The knowledge that used to live in ordinary mothers and fathers and grandparents, passed down at the stove, at the workbench, at the sewing basket, hand to hand, without anyone calling it education. On the January night, the modern family had a house full of the finest equipment ever built, and no one who knew what to do when it went dark. The old family had far less, and someone who knew exactly what to do because they'd done it 1,000 times, on 1,000 ordinary days, long before it was ever an emergency. They had less, but they knew more, and that, in the end, is the whole story. So the power came back on, eventually. It always does. 2 days later, the line was repaired, the hum returned to the modern house, the refrigerator shuddered back to life, the furnace caught, the water moved again through the pipes. The family cleaned out what had spoiled, and within a week, the whole thing was a story they told, the time the power went out for 2 days in January. But something stayed with them after the lights came back, a quiet awareness they didn't have before. They had felt, for 48 cold hours, how completely their comfortable life rested on a single thread, and how little they would have known to do if that thread had stayed cut for a week or a month. They had glimpsed the dependence that runs underneath modern life, invisible, right up until the moment it isn't. And that's really why we walked back into the old house tonight. Not to tell you the past was better, it wasn't. It was harder, colder, heavier, and full of labor that broke people down and wore them out, and no one who lived it is asking you to romanticize a single hour of it. The washing machine, the electric light, the refrigerator, the furnace, those weren't the enemy, they were mercies. They gave families, and especially the women who carried the worst of that labor, hours and years of their lives back. That's real, and it matters, and it should never be waved away. But somewhere in accepting all those mercies, the modern home let go of something it didn't mean to let go of. It let go of the second way. It let go of the redundancy, the backup behind the backup, and traded it, one quiet convenience at a time, for a comfort that only works as long as everything works. And it let go of the deepest thing of all, the person standing in the middle of the house who understood how every piece of it ran, and what to do when a piece stopped. That knowledge didn't vanish in the 1930s. That's the part I want you to take with you. It lived on for decades, in kitchens and cellars and workbenches all over this country. It lived in a mother who saved buttons and could stretch a Sunday roast into Wednesday, in a father who never called a repairman because he simply fixed it himself, in a grandmother who knew what was in the pantry without ever opening the door. A great many of you were raised by those people. You grew up inside the echo of that decade, watching hands that knew how to make things last. And maybe, back then, you thought it was just how old folks were. Now you know what it really was. It was a whole way of living that assumed the world might not always cooperate, and made sure the house was ready anyway. They were poor, some of those years, but they were never, ever helpless. If any of this brought back a memory, a face, a kitchen, a pair of hands you haven't thought about in a long while, I'd ask you to do 3 small things. Subscribe to the Depression-era home so we can keep sitting together in these old rooms. Give this video a like so it finds more people who remember. And then, down in the comments, tell us the one thing your mother, your father, or your grandparent knew how to do that you wish more people knew how to do today. The button they saved, the fire they could bank, the meal they could pull out of almost nothing. And if there's someone in your life who lived this, or who was raised by someone who did, share this with them. Your memory might be the very thing that helps someone else remember theirs. Because in the end, this was never really about wood stoves and root cellars and jars on a shelf. It was about people who took less, and knew more, and quietly kept the whole house going, long after the world outside had gone dark.